Welcome to Eve's Creative Laboratory. I'm Eve, and it's the weekend again, and I actually can't believe that I finished my last project in less than a week. So today I'm starting a new project, and again I'm going to be making a quilt from a bundle that I purchased from Jordan Fabrics. Today's quilt is called All in a Row, and it's so pretty. There's so many colors. There's lots of floral prints in this, and so I can't wait to get started. The first order of business in this pattern is to mark all of the background squares with a diagonal line on the back side so that I can add them to my other squares that I cut. And there's a lot of background squares, so this could potentially take quite a while. I took a short break to go grocery shopping and go to Costco to get some food for the week so we're not hungry, and I got tricked into buying this braided apple strudel from Costco because I was shopping while hungry. So I'm gonna eat this while I finish the rest of my marking on this fabric, and then I'll continue. Hi, I'm back. I finally finished all of the background squares, marking the diagonal line across them. And now I have to sew the background squares to all of these labeled squares because these are going to turn into the petals of the flowers that are in the quilt top. So I have to sew 3 background squares to each of these different color petals. And then I can assemble the quilt top. After chain piecing the 2 background squares onto all of the A's, I still have to put a background square in a 3rd corner. But since I've done this to all the A's, I think I'm going to do the same process to B, C, D, E, and F's. Then I'm going to press all of them and then cut off the excess layers. And once I'm done with that, then I will sew the 3rd corner onto all of them, and I'm going to chain piece all of them. I think that will expedite the process. All right, I pressed all of the triangles out. I still need to cut off the backing and this layer. And I need to cut them apart before I sew on the third corner. But look how cool it came out all together. There, I have these long chains of this fabric. It looks kind of like a segmented kite, I think. Anyway, I'm gonna cut all of these apart and sew on the 3rd square. The next step is making strip units for part of the border of the patchwork. Now it's time to make the flower blocks. I've sewn all of these letter squares to these quarter blocks up here. And now I need to assemble the whole flower. So the flower gets 4 of the letter blocks of the same color, and they go like this, and they're opposite. No, the green one goes first, then the pink, then another green, then another pink, like this, and then one of these guys goes in the center, like that. But when I stitch these together, I need to sew some partial seams. So let me do a demonstration on how to do the partial seams, because this really is the trickiest part of this pattern. The first step is to sew the middle square onto this petal. So I'm going to flip it over like this, and I'm going to sew from about halfway here to the edge. And my machine has a fix setting, so it creates a knot, so I don't have to back tack here. But if your machine doesn't have that, I would back tack here. So I'm going to start about halfway, and then I'm going to just sew until the end. And cut. Okay, so this is half sewn there. So now this edge is sewn together, and I can attach this piece to this piece. So I'm gonna flip this right sides together, and now I can sew from here to here. So I start with the needle down. I butt this fabric up to the edge of the needle and start stitching. And make sure that both of these pieces of fabric are lined up straight. And now I can use my stiletto to guide this fabric under the needle so the stitch stays straight to the very edge. And cut. now this piece is sewn on, and I can sew these two pieces together. So I'm gonna flip this right sides together, and now I can sew from this edge to this edge. Start with the needle down, butt this fabric up to the needle, and start stitching. And cut. Now this piece is stitched on here, and I can sew the last piece on. So I'm going to get this flap out of the way, turn this right sides together, and now I can stitch from this edge to this edge. Start with the needle down, press this up against the needle, and start stitching. And cut. Now, the last part is just to finish this partial seam which we started with. So I can flip these right sides together here. And now I can sew from this edge all the way to the end of this partial seam that we sewed at the very beginning. So let's start with the needle down again. Put this edge all the way up to the edge of the needle and start stitching. So I'm just making sure that these two pieces of fabric are lined up properly. And now I'm going to use my stiletto to maneuver the fabric underneath the needle so the needle ends up exactly in line with this first partial stitch here. And then I'm just going to stitch a few stitches past the edge of the end of the first partial stitch so that it's tacked together. And now I can cut. And there we go. I've finished all the blocks for the quilt top. It came out really nice. Now I just need to attach these together. So I'll sew all the rows together, and then I will attach these borders. So there's a skinny border of just plain fabric, and then there's this floral border that goes around the edge. And once that's done, I will sandwich and work on the quilt binding. This is where I left off on the quilt before I had knee surgery, but see, I couldn't work on it for a long time because I just had surgery and I couldn't move around. So I have sewn the bottom 3 rows together so far. So I need to sew these 3 rows and then attach them all together. And then I'm going to sew on the 2 borders and the binding. The pattern that I'm using switched these. This was supposed to be the border and this was supposed to be the binding, but I like this fabric better, so I want it to show on the top more. So that's what I'm gonna do next, and then after I finish the quilt top I will show that, but I think the next video is going to be quilting on a domestic sewing machine, so I'm going to show that in a different video. I'm going to switch to the other angle. Maybe that'll be easier to see. So this seam right here, they don't exactly line up, so I'm going to flip the bottom seam toward the needle, and this one is already away from the needle, so I just want to make sure that this nests so that when I'm done sewing the quilt top, it will be a nice corner for this little fur patch here. But sometimes they don't exactly match up, so you have to kind of wiggle the fabric around until it sits nicely in its spot. And I hold it with my stiletto so that my finger is protected as it goes under the needle. Okay, now this is the same thing. Although now that seam that I just sewed fit, it made this one fit. So these are lining up well. And this one, I'm going to flip the bottom seam toward me or away from the needle, since this one is facing the needle. And I can feel with my fingers that that's in the correct place now. Now this is where I need to take care not to stitch off this point. The previous seam goes this way and this way. So where the X marks the spot, I want to preserve this point. So I'm going to sew just to the right of this point here. So I'm going to use my stiletto to maneuver the fabric so that it hits in the correct spot. And then the next seam that I have to match up is this one right here. And the seams are facing the same way, so I'm going to flip the bottom seam toward the needle. This one's lining up pretty well. So I'm just gonna hold it with my fingers until I get to my sewing arm. Okay, now I can use my stiletto. Okay. Now this seam is matching up pretty well. So the bottom seam is flipped toward the needle, and the top seam is flipped away from the needle. I can feel that it's nesting, so I'm going to hold it. There. Now this one, both seams are facing the same way, so I'm going to flip the bottom seam away from the needle. And that's fitting well. I'm going to hold it with my stiletto and go right under the needle. Right, now this point I don't want to stitch off, so I'm going to hold this down. Oops. There. That was perfect. Now the next seam that has to match up is the last one down here. So it's not exactly lined up. The green fabric is a little closer to the needle than the pink fabric. So I'm going to flip this bottom seam toward the needle, and this top one is faced away from the needle. But I'm going to nest these right now before it gets too close to being sewed. And I'm going to hold it right here. So the bottom piece of fabric is a little looser than the top, but if I slightly stretch it as I'm sewing, it will end up in the right spot. So I'm going to slightly pull on this fabric on the top. So this seam can reach the needle at the same time, even though my top one is a little bit tighter than my bottom fabric. And normally you wouldn't stretch or try to stretch your fabric, but sometimes in order to line your seams up properly, one needs to be a little bit stretched out. So now it's good. The seam matched up, and I'll show you what it looks like when I'm done. So I just want to make sure that these two corners are reaching the needle at the same time. And there we go. Let me get my little starter here. Okay. So this is the seam that I was just trying to match. And you can see that it was a pretty good match here. And I stretched out the top fabric, which was the green side, a little bit right after I sewed this point. So this point has been preserved, and it's a nice corner there. And since I stretched the fabric from this point to here, there are no puckers. So if your seam is a little bit off, you can stretch one fabric a little bit, not too much, and that'll help your seams line up. So let me get the rest of this quilt top stitched up. I finished sewing the quilt top and it turned out great. I love this border. It's so pretty. And these 4 patches, this is where the blocks came together, and they came out pretty good. Most of my edges matched up here, and also the points of the petals, I was able to preserve them. I don't know if any got stitched off, so that was really good. So the next thing I need to do is sandwich it, and I think I'm gonna do that in the next video. So thank you for watching.